Winter is more than a season. It is a force that has shaped human history, a cold so deep it can silence entire civilizations and test the limits of endurance. From the first sparks of fire in Ice Age caves to the frozen streets of Leningrad, humans have faced winters that seemed impossible to survive. Frostbite, hunger, and blizzards do not discriminate. Entire landscapes have been buried under snow, crops destroyed by unrelenting cold, and empires brought to their knees. Yet across every century, fire, ingenuity, and persistence have kept life flickering in the darkness. This is a story of survival against relentless cold, of courage in the face of icy despair, and of the fragile flame that has allowed humanity to endure. It is a story of winters that test the body, the mind, and the spirit, and of the warmth that has always been the key to continuing through the coldest nights. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The Ice Age dawns, and the world is draped in white. Vast sheets of ice stretch across continents, towering mountains of frozen time that seem immovable, eternal, and silent. The air is sharp, biting at skin and bone. Forests shrink beneath the cold. Animals move slowly, their breath hanging in the stillness like smoke. For our earliest ancestors, this is not simply weather. It is a world that tests every heartbeat. They gather where stone walls offer shelter. Caves become havens, dark and close, smelling of earth and damp stone. Inside, families huddle together, bodies pressed for warmth, every flicker of fire their fragile defense against the endless night. Outside, snow drifts like ash, covering paths and silencing the forest. The cold presses in from every side, patient and merciless. The discovery of fire is not just survival, it is a miracle. Sparks coaxed from stone, embers nursed into flame, each small blaze glowing against the darkness. The fire hisses, crackles, and glows, pushing back the shadows, creating a circle of safety where frost cannot reach. It gives light, heat, and hope, yet the flame is always delicate. Too little fuel, too much wind, and it dies, leaving only darkness and the cruel cold. For the first humans, each night is a test. They feed the fire with branches, twigs, and scraps of bone. They breathe carefully on embers to bring them back to life. Around the flames, stories are murmured. Faces glow in the light. Children fall asleep to the rhythm of fire's crackle. Parents watch the entrance of the cave, listening for the distant call of wolves or the groan of shifting ice. Outside, the land is a frozen desert. Mammoths move across the horizon, their massive bodies adapted to the cold. Woolly rhinoceroses scrape snow to find buried grass. Saber-toothed cats stalk the edges of herds, shadows in the snow. For humans, these creatures are both danger and salvation, for their hides give warmth, and their meat sustains families through the cruelest months. But even with tools, fur, and fire, survival is fragile. Frostbite threatens fingers and toes. Hunger waits at the edge of every day. A misstep in the snow, a fire left untended, and life slips away as easily as breath in the night air. The cold is unrelenting. Yet against this merciless season, humanity endures. The first cold fire is more than flame. It is defiance. It is the beginning of memory, of story, of hope. It is the fragile light that proves even in the deadliest winters, humans find a way to survive. Across the endless expanse of the Ice Age tundra, the horizon is a blur of white and gray. Snow lies heavy on the ground, and the air carries the sharp sting of frozen wind. Trees are scarce here, bent and twisted by the cold, their branches groaning under layers of ice. The land seems lifeless at first glance, but far in the distance, shadows move, giant silhouettes rising against the flat horizon. They are mammoths, colossal beasts, draped in thick coats of shaggy hair, their curved tusks stretching like great white crescents into the sky. For the hunters who follow them, these creatures are both fear and salvation. A single mammoth can feed and clothe an entire community. Its hide becomes shelter, its bones serve as tools, its meat sustains life when winter's cruelty offers little else. Yet the chase is perilous. These giants move slowly but powerfully, trudging through snow with a weight that shakes the earth. A startled mammoth can crush hunters beneath its massive feet or scatter a group with the sweep of its tusks. To pursue such a beast demands courage, patience, and unity. Men and women move silently across the frozen ground, their breath clouding in the cold air. Spears tipped with sharpened stone glint faintly in the pale light. They track the mammoths for days, reading the impressions of massive footprints pressed deep into the snow, following trails of dung still steaming in the frost. The hunters know the rhythm of these herds, the way they gather near frozen rivers, the way mothers guard their young, the way the old lag behind. Survival depends on reading these signs and on striking at the right moment. The world around them is vast, yet peril stalks every step. Packs of wolves prowl the edges of the herd, their yellow eyes watching from the distance. Saber-toothed cats slink low, hidden until they burst forward with terrifying speed. The hunters know that in this frozen land, they are not the only predators. Fire keeps them safe at night, but out here on the open tundra, only numbers and strategy hold death at bay. When the hunters finally draw close, the air is thick with tension. A spear is lifted, muscles tighten. The silence of the tundra is broken by the thunder of feet and the cries of men. It is a battle of will against beast, a clash between fragile humans and the ancient giants of ice. For every successful hunt, there is relief, gratitude, and reverence. The mammoth is not simply prey, it is a gift of survival, a lifeline across the endless winters. On this frozen horizon, humanity's endurance is written in each step that follows the herd. In the heart of the Neolithic Age, far from the endless tundras of the Ice Age, people found a new way to endure winter. They built a village unlike any before it, a place pressed close together as though the houses themselves huddled for warmth. This place was called Çatalhöyük, and here, survival meant not only battling the cold but also learning to live as a community, bound together by clay, fire, and shared endurance. When the snows came, the narrow alleys between homes disappeared beneath heavy drifts. The people of the village did not walk the streets. The people of the village did not walk the streets. The narrow alleys between homes did not walk the streets. Instead, they climbed ladders and crossed rooftops, flat clay surfaces hardened by the sun and the fire of human hands. From above, the rooftops formed pathways, connecting one home to another, weaving a network of movement above the white silence that swallowed the ground. Each house was made from mud brick, thick walls that held in the warmth of the hearth. Inside, families gathered around fires built in central ovens. The air smelled of smoke, roasted grain, and drying meat hung from beams overhead. Children pressed close to their mothers, listening to stories told in the flicker of firelight. Winter was harsh, but the village was alive with sound, with warmth, and with the presence of many families enduring together. Food was stored carefully, grain sealed in clay bins, protected from damp and frost. Hunters returned from the plains with deer and wild cattle, their hides stretched across walls, their meat preserved in the cold air. Farmers brought in harvests long before the snows, grinding wheat into flour, making bread that sustained the months when fields lay silent under frost. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of hide, every bone, every grain of seed had its purpose. Yet survival was never simple. The cold crept into every crack, and sickness spread quickly when the air grew damp and bitter. Some winters took many lives, and the villagers mourned together, their burial rituals carried out beneath the very floors they slept upon. The dead remained with the living, their presence woven into the fabric of the home, a reminder of both loss and endurance. Still, Çatalhöyük endured. Its rooftops echoed with footsteps in snow, its hearths glowed with fire, its walls stood firm against the winds of winter. Here, people discovered that survival was not only a matter of strength but of closeness, of sharing warmth and food, of protecting one another when the cold pressed hardest. The village beneath the snow was more than shelter. It was a testament that even in the harshest of seasons, humanity could build a world where life continued, where hope flickered like fire in the long winter night. The Roman Empire stretched its banners farther than any before it, reaching into lands of forests, rivers, and distant horizons. From the warm heart of the Mediterranean, legions marched northward, bringing roads, walls, and the authority of Rome. Yet, as they pushed into the wilds of northern Europe, they found a force that neither discipline nor empire could command. Winter stood waiting. For soldiers born beneath the southern sun, the cold was an enemy more relentless than any barbarian horde. Leather sandals pressed into snow, feet wrapped in scraps of cloth that froze stiff before morning. Cloaks pulled tight against the wind, offered little protection when blizzards descended, swallowing whole columns of men in whirling white. The cold did not yield to the might of Rome. It crept into bone, numbed fingers that once held spears steady, and turned proud soldiers into shivering shadows of themselves. On the Rhine frontier, forts built of stone and timber became islands in a sea of frost. Fires roared in hearths, yet the chill lingered. Grain supplies dwindled when carts could not cross snowbound roads, and soldiers rationed bread, stretching every crust through endless nights. Wolves prowled outside the walls, their howls carrying through frozen forests, a reminder that Rome's presence was fragile on this edge of the world. The barbarians who lived beyond the frontier were different. They were children of the cold, born into winters that Rome could scarcely endure. Wrapped in furs, moving with the rhythm of the seasons, they struck when the snow fell hardest, when Roman patrols were weakest and fires burned low. To the legions, these people seemed as much a part of winter as the storms themselves, emerging from white forests like shadows and vanishing into them again. Still, Rome did not turn back easily. Roads were cut through frozen landscapes, watchtowers rose against the horizon, and soldiers learned to endure as best they could. They layered wool beneath armor, carried torches through snow, and built stockpiles of food and firewood in preparation for each long season. Yet for every fortress that stood, another fell to cold and hunger, not to the sword. Winter along the northern frontier was a teacher Rome could not silence. It showed that conquest had limits, that empire could be slowed not only by men but by snow, ice, and wind. For all the legion's discipline, the blizzards cared nothing for banners, ranks, or glory. The frozen frontiers reminded the empire that even the greatest power could be humbled by the simple, enduring force of winter. The year was 1816, a time remembered not for war or conquest, but for a season that never came. It began with an eruption, half a world away. Mount Tambora, a towering volcano in Indonesia, exploded with a force the world had not witnessed in centuries. Ash and dust rose high into the atmosphere, carried by winds across oceans and continents. The skies dimmed, and the world grew colder. In Europe, in North America, and far beyond, people waited for warmth that never arrived. Spring came late, hesitant, and weak. June mornings dawned with frost across New England fields, ice glazing the edges of rivers, killing the tender shoots that promised harvest. Snow fell in summer months, drifting over farms where cattle stood bewildered in frozen pastures. In the silence of each dawn, farmers stared at their ruined crops, knowing hunger would follow. The sun itself seemed changed. Its light was pale, filtered through veils of ash and dust. Days were dim, and evenings arrived early, shadows stretching across villages long before their time. Clouds hung heavy and strange, colors bleeding across the sky in fiery hues as the ash scattered the light. People spoke of omens, of a world touched by divine anger, for no memory lived of a summer that failed to come. In Europe, the hardships were severe. The cold and the endless rains drowned fields, wheat rotted before it could ripen, and entire harvests were lost. Bread prices soared, riots broke out in towns where the poor could no longer afford food. Mothers tried to quiet children's cries with scraps of potatoes, with crusts hard as stone. In Switzerland, hunger grew so desperate that entire families left their homes in search of relief, wandering roads in the hope of finding food that did not exist. In New England, families huddled through bitter nights, burning furniture to keep fires alive. Farmers slaughtered livestock they could not feed, salting what meat they could to survive the long, cruel months. Many gave up on their land altogether, pushing westward into the unknown, chasing the promise of better seasons. Hunger became a silent companion, walking beside every man, woman, and child. The year without a summer left scars that lingered for decades. It revealed how fragile human life was before the power of nature, how easily a single event on a distant shore could ripple across the world, turning fertile land to wasteland, hope to despair. Yet even as hunger pressed hardest, people endured. They planted again, they stored what little they had, and they carried on, waiting for the warmth that would eventually return. The summer of 1816 never truly came, but the memory of it would never fade. The dawn of the year 1709 brought with it a silence that spread across Europe, a silence born of bitter, unrelenting cold. From Russia to France, from the Alps to the lowlands, the land froze harder and deeper than any living person could remember. It was called the Great Frost, and it was the coldest winter of the millennium. The freeze struck suddenly. Rivers hardened into glass, their currents stilled beneath thick sheets of ice. Lakes turned solid, their surfaces stretching unbroken for miles. In vineyards, barrels of wine split open, their contents frozen into blocks so solid they could be lifted like stone. Olive trees cracked in the night, their trunks splitting under the pressure of ice that formed within them. Orchards died standing, their branches snapping in the weight of frost. In cities, life slowed to a crawl. In Paris, the Seine lay frozen from bank to bank, silent except for the creak of ice shifting beneath the cold Sunday. Wolves prowled the streets, drawn from the forests by hunger, their cries echoing through alleys where people huddled indoors. Firewood was scarce, and prices soared beyond the reach of the poor. Families burned furniture to survive, feeding hearths with chairs, tables, and doors. Yet even fire seemed weak against the sharpness of the air, the frost creeping back into homes before the embers died. Food supplies dwindled as grain froze in storage, and mills stood useless beside frozen streams. Bread became rare, then precious, then almost unreachable for the common people. Hunger spread across Europe with the same patience as the frost itself. In France, entire villages faced starvation. In Germany, peasants dug beneath the snow for frozen turnips. In Italy, even the normally mild valleys lay gripped by ice, their crops ruined before they could grow. The wealthy suffered less, yet even palaces could not keep the frost at bay. Servants shattered sheets of ice from inside water jugs, and noblemen dined in coats and furs as the breath of their words clouded the air. No rank, no wealth, no power could command the cold to leave. Millions shivered through those months, and many did not live to see the thaw. The Great Frost left behind not only hunger and death, but also the memory of how fragile life could be when nature turned merciless. Across Europe, families remembered that winter as a time when even the strongest fires felt small, when every breath of cold air carried a reminder of mortality. The Great Frost of 1709 stood as a warning etched in ice, that humanity, for all its power and ambition, remained at the mercy of the seasons. The Norse people, bold sailors and farmers, carried their longships beyond the familiar fjords of Scandinavia into colder, harsher lands. They reached Iceland, Greenland, and for a time even North America, bringing with them cattle, sheep, tools, and the unshakable belief that they could carve life from the ice. Their homes rose from stone and turf, roofs covered in grass to shield against the bitter wind. Inside, families gathered around central fires, smoke curling through holes in the roof, warmth held fast against walls packed thick with earth. At first, the seas granted passage. The Gulf Stream carried their ships, and summer brought brief seasons of green. Iceland's valleys bloomed with grass for grazing, Greenland's shores yielded meadows where cattle fed, and the settlers believed they had tamed even these distant edges of the world. They planted barley, built churches, and laid graveyards where their dead could rest under stone. The North seemed theirs to claim. But winters grew harsher. The Little Ice Age crept across the North Atlantic, and storms came heavier, longer, more violent than before. The seas that once carried them turned to enemies, scattering ships or trapping them in crushing ice. Trade with Europe, once steady, faltered. Wood grew scarce in Greenland, forcing settlers to burn bones for fuel, while livestock weakened in fields buried too long in snow. Hunger shadowed the longhouses. Families ate dried fish, seal meat, whatever could be hunted or stored. Yet even the hunts grew harder, as ice pressed closer to the coasts and storms cut them off from the sea. Some turned to walrus ivory, trading what they could gather with merchants brave enough to make the journey. But each year fewer ships appeared on the horizon. Isolation deepened, and winters stretched darker. Still, the Norse endured with stubborn pride. They told sagas of ancestors who crossed oceans, stories of gods who thrived in halls of ice, and they held fast to the rhythms of their faith and their farms. But the cold showed little mercy. Crops failed more often, cattle starved, and whole communities vanished from the coasts of Greenland. The sea that once opened new worlds now closed them in silence. Viking winters were not simply seasons of cold. They were battles fought each year, between flame and frost, between endurance and surrender. For a time, the Norse settlers stood against them with courage and skill, but in the end, the storms proved stronger. Their homes crumbled, their churches emptied, and the North kept its secrets, reminding the world that not even the bravest sailors could conquer the endless winter. For centuries, a long chill settled over Europe. It was not a single winter, nor a brief season of hardship, but an age of cold that crept into every life. Historians would later call it the Little Ice Age, a span of hundreds of years when summers shortened, harvests failed, and winters grew harsher than memory could recall. In England, the River Thames hardened into stone. Where once ships carried goods to the heart of London, now ice stretched from bank to bank, thick enough to bear crowds. Markets sprang up on the frozen surface, bright with tents and stalls. Merchants sold food and trinkets, jugglers entertained, and children skated where water had once flowed. These frost fairs brought a strange joy, but beneath the laughter lingered the reality that such cold starved fields and froze orchards beyond the city walls. Across the continent, other rivers froze as well. The canals of the Netherlands turned into glittering highways, their surfaces crowded with skaters gliding past windmills. Paintings from the time show villages blanketed in white, frozen lakes filled with people. Yet beauty carried its own cost. Crops withered in shortened growing seasons, vineyards produced less wine, and families braced for hunger each year. The frost lingered too long. For farmers, the Little Ice Age was merciless. Fields turned hard before grain could ripen. Sheep starved when pastures lay buried in snow. In some years, entire harvests failed, and famine spread across regions already weakened by disease and war. In France, bread riots shook cities as the poor struggled to buy even the smallest crust. In Scandinavia, whole villages abandoned their homes, driven out by repeated failed harvests. The seas, too, bore the mark of this age. Icebergs drifted farther south than ever before, menacing fishing boats and trade ships. Storms raged with greater violence, sinking vessels that once carried lifelines of grain and goods. Coastal communities lived with the constant threat of hunger and flood, the sea no longer a friend but an unpredictable foe. Still, life adapted. People built sturdier homes, layered their clothing in wool and fur, and learned new ways to store and preserve food. The frost fairs became symbols of resilience, a kind of defiance against the cold. Communities gathered on frozen rivers not only to trade but to remind themselves that life could continue, even thrive, in the grip of winter. The Little Ice Age left behind a landscape of memory of frozen rivers, starving fields, and crowded hearths. It reminded Europe that the strength of humanity lay not in commanding nature but in enduring it, in finding light, warmth, and laughter, even when the world itself seemed locked in ice. In the year 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the largest army Europe had ever seen into the vast expanse of Russia. More than 600,000 soldiers marched beneath his banners, the Grande Armée, carrying dreams of swift victory. They expected battles won with muskets and cannons, but instead they would face an enemy older and far more merciless than any army, the Russian winter. The campaign began with confidence. French soldiers advanced deep into Russian lands, but the Russian army refused decisive battle. Villages were abandoned and burned, fields stripped bare, wells poisoned, and barns emptied. The land itself turned against Napoleon's men. Supplies dwindled, and the long march offered only hunger and exhaustion. By the time the army reached Moscow, the city was aflame, consumed by fire set by its own people. Victory turned to ash, and the soldiers soon began the long retreat. Winter arrived early that year. Snow fell heavy across the endless plains, blanketing the world in silence and ice. The men were ill-prepared, wearing thin uniforms and boots that cracked in the cold. Many wrapped their feet in rags, but the frost bit through cloth and leather alike. Horses collapsed on frozen roads, their bodies stiffening where they fell, and without them wagons and artillery were abandoned to the snow. Frostbite became a greater enemy than the Russian soldiers. Fingers blackened and broke, noses and ears froze away, and men collapsed from the cold, never rising again. Campfires struggled against the wind, and food was nearly gone. Men boiled leather straps for soup or gnawed on frozen horseflesh to survive. Each day, thousands fell, not to musket fire, but to hunger and frost. The Russian army, though cautious, pressed the retreat, harassing the stragglers, striking at weakened columns, and driving the invaders deeper into despair. The roads became graveyards marked by frozen corpses, each step forward a struggle for life. Of the hundreds of thousands who had marched into Russia with Napoleon, only a fraction stumbled back across the border months later. The retreat from Moscow became a symbol of the limits of power. Cannons, cavalry, and disciplined ranks could conquer kingdoms, but they could not command the seasons. The snow, the cold, and the endless hunger reduced the proud Grande Armée to a shattered remnant. Napoleon's dream of dominance over Europe cracked in the ice of Russia. His soldiers left behind not victories but memories of endless white fields, the sound of boots crunching on frozen ground, and the silence of men who could march no farther. The retreat showed that even the greatest conqueror could be undone by the simple, brutal hand of winter. In the winter of 1777, the American Revolution nearly froze to death in the hills of Pennsylvania. General George Washington led his weary army to a place called Valley Forge, a stretch of land chosen for its defensible position and closeness to supply routes. But supplies did not come. What awaited the soldiers was not comfort, but a season of suffering. 12,000 men trudged into camp that December, already battered by battles and long marches. Many wore uniforms in tatters, coats torn thin, and boots worn down to nothing. Some had no shoes at all, wrapping their feet in rags or bits of cloth. In the snow, their footprints stained red with blood, a silent trail of their endurance. The cold was merciless. Frost covered the hills, winds cut through tents and log huts hastily built from green wood, and smoke from countless fires stung eyes that already wept from hunger. Disease spread quickly in the crowded quarters. Dysentery, typhus, and smallpox took more lives than bullets or bayonets. Graves filled silently in the frozen ground, each one a reminder of how fragile the cause of independence had become. Food was scarce, and the hunger gnawed louder than the sound of muskets. Supplies promised by Congress and the states often never arrived. Soldiers boiled thin stews from what little they could find, sometimes eating fire cakes, simple flour and water baked on stones that provided more hope than nourishment. Livestock grew thin and then disappeared. Many men fainted during drills, weakened by months of near starvation. Yet within this crucible, the army transformed. Washington held firm, walking among his men, sharing their hardships, and refusing to abandon the camp. His presence gave them strength. Then came Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who brought with him the discipline and training of Europe's finest armies. On frozen fields, he drilled the ragged soldiers, teaching them new maneuvers, new formations, and the habits of a professional fighting force. Day by day, the men grew stronger, not in comfort, but in spirit. They marched with greater precision, loaded their muskets faster, and learned to fight as one. Valley Forge became more than a camp. It became a forge in truth, reshaping an army from weary militia into a weapon capable of standing against the might of Britain. By the time spring thawed the frozen ground, the soldiers who limped into Valley Forge were gone. In their place stood men hardened by winter, bound together by shared suffering, and prepared to fight not just for survival, but for victory. The blood in the snow, the hunger in their bellies, and the frost in their bones had not broken them. It had remade them. In the autumn of 1846, a group of pioneers set out across the mountains of California, chasing the promise of fertile land and a new beginning. They were families, not soldiers, men, women, and children, bound together in a wagon train known as the Donner Party. They carried with them tools, livestock, and dreams of a better life. But as they pushed their wagons into the towering Sierra Nevada, winter closed in faster than they could escape. Snow came suddenly and without mercy. In late October, storms swept through the passes, piling drifts as high as the wagons themselves. Roads vanished beneath white walls, and oxen sank and stumbled in the drifts. With each passing day, the snow deepened until forward movement became impossible. Families turned their wagons into shelters, clustering together in makeshift camps by the frozen lakes and forests. They had been caught in the teeth of winter, and there would be no easy escape. At first, they rationed what food remained: flour and cornmeal, bacon and beans, stretched into thin meals that grew smaller each day. Then the supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Hunger hollowed the faces of the children, weakened the strongest men, and left everyone in despair. Hunting brought little relief, for game was scarce in the deep snow, and fishing lines froze before they touched the water. The silence of the snow became unbearable, broken only by the sound of the wind and the cries of the hungry. As weeks turned into months, desperation grew. Families burned furniture for warmth and boiled leather to soften it into something barely edible. But when even that failed, darker choices were made. Some looked upon the frozen bodies of those who had died and saw the only way to keep the living alive. It was a choice born of desperation, whispered in shame and carried out in silence. Rescue parties attempted to reach them, but the journey through the mountains was long and treacherous. When the first relief group finally arrived in February, they found a scene of unimaginable suffering. Survivors, gaunt and hollow-eyed, clung to life in ragged shelters buried beneath the snow. Many had perished, and those who remained carried scars that would never fade. Of the 87 who entered the Sierra Nevada that autumn, fewer than 50 walked out alive. The rest were claimed by hunger, frost, and the relentless snow. The tale of the Donner Pass became a warning etched into history, a reminder of how quickly dreams of a better future can be buried beneath the weight of winter. It was a story of tragedy, of endurance, and of the haunting choices people make when the silence of snow is all that remains. In September of 1941, the German army encircled the city of Leningrad, cutting off its people from the rest of the world. What began as a military blockade soon became one of the deadliest winters ever endured by human beings. For nearly 900 days, the city was starved, frozen, and bombarded, its people trapped in a cage of ice and fire. When the first snows fell, the food had already begun to vanish. Rations were reduced to almost nothing. Adults received a few ounces of bread each day, children even less. But even this bread was no comfort, for it was baked with sawdust and ground straw, more filler than flour. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at every stomach, dulling every thought. Families shared crumbs as though they were feasts, stretching each crust to last another day. As winter deepened, temperatures plummeted to 40 below zero. Heating fuel ran out, and families burned whatever they could find: furniture, books, floorboards, anything that might give a moment of warmth. Water pipes froze, leaving people to hack at ice in the streets or melt snow over makeshift stoves. Entire apartment blocks turned into tombs of silence, where the cold seeped into every corner. The death toll rose with each passing week. People collapsed in the streets from exhaustion and hunger, their bodies stiffening where they fell. Children fell asleep beside their mothers and never woke again. Entire generations froze together in their beds. Disease spread easily in the weakened population, and even the strong were broken by starvation. By the end of that first winter, hundreds of thousands were gone. Yet even in the face of such despair, the people of Leningrad endured. Musicians played in concert halls, even as bombs fell nearby. A symphony composed during the siege was performed in the city itself, broadcast to the world as a symbol that the spirit of Leningrad would not die. Workers continued to labor in factories, producing weapons and supplies for the front, even as they starved. Teachers held classes in basements, determined that knowledge should survive where bodies might not. Relief came slowly, through a frozen lifeline across Lake Ladoga. Trucks carried food and supplies over the ice, a dangerous journey known as the Road of Life. It was never enough, but it kept the city from perishing entirely. When the siege was finally lifted in 1944, the survivors emerged thin, scarred, and hollow-eyed. Yet they had endured nearly 3 years of suffering that defied imagination. The siege of Leningrad stood as a testament not only to the cruelty of war and winter, but to the resilience of human beings who refused to surrender, even when death pressed against every door. In 1915, deep in the heart of Antarctica, a ship named the Endurance became a prisoner of the ice. Ernest Shackleton, the explorer who commanded her, had set out to cross the frozen continent from sea to sea. Instead, he and his crew would find themselves trapped in a world of endless night, drifting helplessly in a sea of ice that stretched beyond imagination. The first grip of winter came suddenly. Sheets of ice closed around the hull, pressing with a strength no timber could resist. The ship groaned like a living thing, its beams bending under the strain. Men listened in their bunks to the cracking of frozen wood, never knowing if the next shudder would split the vessel in two. The Endurance was locked fast, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. The crew built their lives upon the ice itself. They pitched tents on the frozen surface, cooked over stoves that smoked in the bitter wind, and learned to endure days where the sun never rose. Their breath froze in the air, crystals falling into their beards and onto their blankets. Food grew scarce, and hunting seals and penguins became the only way to fill their bellies. Each meal was uncertain, every day a struggle against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. As months passed, the ship's fate grew grim. The ice shifted and heaved, grinding its jaws tighter around the hull. The sound was like cannon fire, as beams splintered and planks cracked. At last, the Endurance could bear no more. The ship was crushed and sank beneath the ice, leaving the men stranded hundreds of miles from land, with no hope of rescue. Yet Shackleton would not let despair take them. He promised his men that they would survive, that he would bring every one of them home. The crew dragged lifeboats across the ice, hauling them over pressure ridges and frozen wastelands. When the ice finally broke apart, they launched the boats into frigid seas, waves crashing against the small craft as men bailed with bare hands. Their journey was long, filled with storms, frostbite, and hunger, but Shackleton never allowed the flame of hope to die. At last, he and a small group crossed the ocean to seek rescue, leaving the others behind on a desolate island. Months later, against all odds, he returned. Every man was alive. Not one of the crew of the Endurance was lost. Shackleton's frozen sea became not only a story of hardship, but a triumph of leadership, endurance, and unshakable will against the most merciless winter on Earth. In the late 19th century, news of gold in the Yukon spread like wildfire across the world. From cities and farms, from harbors and towns, dreamers gathered their belongings and set out for Alaska and the Canadian North. They imagined glittering nuggets waiting in riverbeds, riches within reach, fortunes earned with little more than a shovel and a pan. What they found instead was winter, a frozen wilderness that swallowed the weak and tested the strong. The journey began with hope, but soon turned to hardship. Men and women carried their supplies over endless trails, through mountain passes buried in snow. The infamous Chilkoot Pass rose before them like a wall of ice, each step a climb into exhaustion. Lines of prospectors stretched across the slopes, bent beneath the weight of food, tools, and tents. Snow blinded their eyes, winds cut their faces, and still they pressed forward, driven by the promise of gold. When they reached the Yukon River valleys, the true challenge revealed itself. Winter descended quickly, blanketing the land in silence. Temperatures plunged far below zero, turning breath into ice and fingers stiff with frostbite. Tents sagged under the weight of snow and often collapsed in the night, leaving men scrambling for shelter in the bitter cold. Fires sputtered in the wind, and even when flames caught, the heat seemed powerless against the vastness of the frozen dark. Food was as valuable as gold, supplies were scarce, and prices soared. A sack of flour or a slab of bacon could cost more than most carried in their pockets. Hunger stalked the camps, and stories spread of men boiling leather or chewing bark just to quiet the ache in their stomachs. Some turned back, defeated by the winter. Others stayed, gambling everything on the hope that spring might reveal riches beneath the thaw. The land itself seemed indifferent to their struggle. Wolves prowled at the edges of camps, rivers froze solid, and avalanches thundered down mountainsides without warning. Many who came seeking fortune never found gold at all. They found graves dug in frozen earth, dreams buried beneath the snow, and silence so deep it felt eternal. Yet the Yukon also shaped survivors. Those who endured returned with stories of courage and perseverance, of men and women who faced the deadliest winters with nothing but grit and stubborn resolve. Some did strike it rich, but more often the riches lay not in gold but in endurance, in the proof that human beings could brave a land where fortune glittered just out of reach, and where the frozen silence tested every dream. In the 1930s, across the Great Plains of America, winter arrived not only with cold, but with storms unlike anything the settlers had ever known. These were not storms of snow or sleet, but storms of dust. The soil, once rich and fertile, had been plowed and broken until nothing held it down. When the rains failed and the winds came, the earth itself took to the sky. Thus began the Dust Bowl years, and with them, the black blizzard winters. The air grew heavy with grit. Winds howled across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and beyond, tearing at the land until fields turned to wasteland. Clouds of dust rose thousands of feet into the air, blotting out the sun and turning day into night. Families who once worked golden wheat fields now faced a horizon swallowed by blackness. Winter cold cut deep, but the dust made it worse. The wind carried sand as sharp as knives, stripping paint from houses, burying fences, and grinding its way into every crack of every home. Inside, people tried to fight the storm. They stuffed rags under doors, taped windows, and hung wet sheets over walls. Yet still the dust came. It coated tables, covered food, and clung to every breath. Mothers wiped dust from the faces of their children only to see it return within moments. Men woke with their lungs full of grit, coughing through nights that never felt clean. Doctors gave the sickness a name: dust pneumonia. Whole families grew weak, their lungs scarred by the very land they had tried to farm. The winters were cruelest of all. Snow mixed with dust, falling in drifts that stank of earth and decay. Winds howled across frozen ground, and the cold cut through threadbare coats. Fires burned low as fuel grew scarce, and families huddled together for warmth in houses half buried beneath dunes of dust. Hunger grew as crops failed year after year. Wheat withered before it ripened, corn shriveled in the fields, and cattle starved on grasslands stripped bare. Children dreamed of milk and bread, while their parents stared at empty cupboards. Yet even in such darkness, life continued. Neighbors shared what little they had, trading beans for flour or firewood for eggs. Churches opened their doors to the homeless, and schools did what they could to keep children learning. Some packed their belongings into battered trucks and set out westward, seeking hope in California or beyond. Others stayed, holding on through storms that seemed endless, praying for rain, for change, for an end to the dust. The black blizzards carved themselves into memory. Stories spread of skies so dark that lamps had to be lit at midday, of cattle suffocated where they stood, of children lost in storms only yards from their front doors. These winters were not only cold, they were suffocating, stripping away both breath and hope. In time, the storms passed. Conservation efforts restored the soil, rains returned, and the land slowly healed. But for those who lived through the black blizzard winters, the memory never faded. They carried in their lungs the dust of the prairies, and in their minds the sound of the wind that once stole both crops and breath. It was a winter not of snow, but of silence and grit, where survival itself became the greatest harvest. In March of 1888, winter struck the northeastern United States with a ferocity that few had ever witnessed. For 3 days and nights, snow fell in torrents, driven by winds that roared like a living thing. The storm swallowed cities and towns, burying homes, crippling railroads, and silencing the great hum of industry. It would be remembered as the Great Blizzard of '88, a storm that turned New York City and much of the region into a frozen labyrinth. The storm began quietly, with rain. People carried on with their business, unaware that the rain was the last sign of gentleness before the skies unleashed their fury. Temperatures plunged, and the rain turned first to sleet, then to heavy snow. The wind rose, howling down streets, toppling chimneys, and tearing at rooftops. Soon snow filled the air so thickly that nothing could be seen beyond a few feet. The city vanished beneath a blinding white curtain. Trains, the pride of the age, ground to a halt. Locomotives became trapped in drifts higher than their smokestacks. Passengers huddled inside frozen cars, waiting for rescue that could not come. Telegraph lines, the veins of communication, snapped like twigs under the weight of ice and snow, cutting New York off from the rest of the nation. Letters, news, and voices were silenced. For days, the greatest city in America was alone in the storm. On the streets, the snow piled deeper with every hour. Drifts rose higher than houses, swallowing wagons and carriages, leaving horses frozen in their traces. People who dared to step outside found themselves trapped, lost within blocks they had known their whole lives. The streets of Manhattan turned into mazes of white walls, narrow passages dug by desperate hands and shovels. Fires flickered in hearths, but coal supplies dwindled as delivery carts could no longer reach neighborhoods cut off by snow. Families wrapped themselves in blankets, huddling for warmth, praying that the storm would pass before the fuel ran out. The blizzard did not spare the countryside. Farmhouses were buried to their rooftops, barns collapsed under the weight of snow, and livestock froze where they stood. Telegraph poles lay splintered across fields, their wires vanishing into the drifts. Small towns were silenced, their main streets buried, their people cut off from the world beyond their doors. When at last the storm ended, the scale of the destruction was revealed. More than 400 lives had been lost. Entire trains had disappeared beneath the snow. Ships sank in the harbors, dashed against the frozen piers by the relentless winds. New York City, proud and bustling, stood paralyzed, its streets still clogged with mountains of ice and snow. But out of the storm came change. The blizzard revealed the fragility of life above ground, exposed to the violence of weather. In its wake, the city began to build underground subways for travel, buried cables for communication systems that would shelter human life from the storms yet to come. The blizzard of '88 was more than a storm. It was a reminder of nature's power, of the way wind and snow could humble a city that thought itself untouchable. For those who lived through it, the memory was carried in every breath of cold wind thereafter. The sound of snow piling against windows, and the silence of streets that had once been buried beneath the white weight of winter. January of 1977 descended upon Buffalo, New York, with a merciless force that would become etched into the memory of every resident. The storm rolled in from Lake Erie, a vast frozen expanse that acted as both a conduit and a magnifier for winter's fury. Winds howled across the city, sweeping snow from the lake and dumping it onto streets, homes, and neighborhoods without pause. What began as a typical winter storm escalated into a blizzard of legendary intensity, leaving Buffalo paralyzed and trapped beneath mountains of ice and snow. The snow came in relentless sheets, piling higher by the hour. Doorways disappeared beneath drifts, sidewalks vanished, and streets became tunnels of white where only the tallest signs emerged from the frozen expanse. Cars parked overnight became monuments to the storm, swallowed whole, their outlines barely visible beneath the weight of accumulated snow. Those who ventured outside quickly learned that the wind was as dangerous as the snow itself. Gusts ripped across open avenues, forcing people back indoors or pinning them against walls, their breath freezing instantly in the frigid air. Electricity flickered and failed. Power lines, coated in ice, snapped under the storm's relentless force. Homes went dark, and furnaces struggled to keep rooms above freezing. Families huddled together, wrapped in blankets, lighting candles for warmth and survival. Water pipes froze, and the simplest tasks, fetching food, carrying water, even stepping outside, became life-threatening undertakings. Hospitals were overwhelmed as frostbite, hypothermia, and accidents from collapsing roofs or snow-laden cars surged. Emergency crews moved cautiously, their progress slowed to a crawl by waist-deep snow and howling winds that erased landmarks and disoriented even the most familiar patrols. The city's transportation grid collapsed. Buses could not traverse the streets. Highways were buried beneath drifts taller than cars. Railways froze, and airports were shuttered, leaving travelers stranded and communities isolated. The storm trapped workers in offices and schools, forcing them to improvise for survival. Windows frosted over completely, obscuring the outside world and creating the sense that Buffalo had been swallowed by an endless white void. Communication became sporadic. Phone lines, burdened by ice and wind, failed intermittently, leaving neighbors cut off from one another. Rescue operations became perilous missions. Emergency teams moved through waste and chest-deep snow, dragging snowplows through streets blocked by fallen trees and abandoned vehicles. Volunteers emerged, armed with shovels and determination, working tirelessly to clear paths to hospitals, shelters, and grocery stores. The storm revealed both the fragility and resilience of the city, showing how quickly modern life could be brought to a halt by nature and how communities could rally in response. After 4 days of relentless fury, the storm began to abate, leaving behind a city transformed. Buffalo was unrecognizable. Streets were rivers of ice, vehicles were buried monuments, and neighborhoods resembled frozen tundras. Yet, amid the destruction and despair, people emerged to clear paths, rescue trapped neighbors, and restore what could be salvaged. The blizzard of '77 was remembered not only for its immense power but for the endurance it demanded, a stark reminder that winter could dominate even the most prepared city. Buffalo survived, battered but unbroken, its citizens forever marked by the storm that had turned their home into a frozen tomb and then back into a testament to human tenacity. In the shadow of the Cold War, the world imagined winters unlike any before. Scientists calculated, projected, and warned of the unthinkable: a nuclear winter, a time when fire and ice would coexist in a terrifying equilibrium. The concept was simple yet horrifying. Explosions of unimaginable force would send smoke and ash high into the stratosphere. Blotting out the Sunday temperatures would plummet. Crops would fail. Rivers and lakes could freeze earlier and thaw later. Humanity, accustomed to seasonal rhythms, would face a season that did not end, a cold that gnawed at bones and hope alike. Governments held secret meetings. Maps were drawn, targets marked, and survival plans sketched in pencil and steel. Cities imagined themselves under a perpetual frost, their inhabitants trapped in shelters, counting days in dimly lit bunkers. The sky, once a canvas of blues and oranges, would turn black. The sun would rise, but its light would be weak, diffused through clouds of smoke and debris. Shadows would lengthen in impossible directions, and daylight would lose its warmth. People envisioned walking through streets blanketed in ash, the scent of burning cities mingling with the bite of frost on lips and fingertips. Scientists modeled famine as accurately as weather patterns. A single nuclear exchange, they calculated, could cause global temperatures to drop dramatically. Crops would wither in fields. Harvests would fail not only where bombs had landed, but across continents, as sunlight was stolen from every latitude. Grain silos would remain empty. Livestock would die from hunger and cold. Refrigerators, useless without power, would store nothing but the cold air already seeping into homes. Hunger would follow the cold. The imagination of nuclear winter was not limited to science. Books, films, and news reports painted pictures of streets littered with abandoned belongings, families huddled together for warmth, and governments issuing ration cards for snow and ice. Children would play in a white world not of snow, but of ash that turned to slush under their feet. Schools would close indefinitely. Hospitals would overflow with frostbite and starvation. The hum of civilization would fade into silence, punctuated only by the wind whistling through broken windows and empty avenues. Families prepared in secret, stockpiling supplies, digging shelters, and learning the ways of a world ruled by cold rather than heat. No one truly knew if they would survive, yet the thought of nuclear winter shaped daily life. Conversations hushed when scientists spoke, debates flared in parliament halls, and citizens watched the sky as though it might already be changing. The fear was pervasive, cold as steel, and relentless. It invaded homes as quietly as the frost could invade a poorly insulated room. In the minds of humanity, nuclear winter became both metaphor and reality. It was a season measured in anxiety as much as in days, a frost that covered the globe without mercy. People imagined themselves shivering under skies darker than any night, surviving on what little sunlight and heat remained. They imagined the silence, thicker and sharper than ice, pressing against walls, filling rooms, and chilling bones. And they imagined the world waiting, frozen in anticipation, for a warmth that might never return. High above the forests and rivers, the world becomes a white desert. Mountains pierce the clouds, their peaks swallowed by snow and ice. Mount Everest, Denali, K, two names that carry both awe and terror, stand as monuments to winters that humans cannot tame. Climbers ascend with careful calculation, each step a dialogue with gravity and frost. The wind does not pause, it screams, cutting through layers of clothing, tearing at exposed skin. Breaths crystallize before they reach lips. The cold is relentless, a living force that refuses compromise. Snowdrifts conceal crevasses, turning solid ground into a trap. Every ridge is a knife's edge. Avalanches roll without warning, tumbling over slopes with a sound that feels like the earth itself is breaking. Frostbite creeps silently, claiming fingers, toes, noses, and ears before pain can even register. The body becomes a fragile instrument, tuned to survival, yet constantly tested against forces far older and stronger than human ambition. Climbers learn to move with precision, to ration energy, to speak only when necessary. Words freeze mid-air, equipment jams, and fingers stiffen around ropes and ice axes. At extreme altitudes, oxygen thins, and time slows. The sun, when it appears, is blinding and deceptive, reflecting off layers of snow and ice, yet offering no warmth. Shadows grow sharp, stretching across faces carved by cold and wind. Nights descend quickly, bringing temperatures far below what any human heart was built to endure. Tents become fragile sanctuaries, pitching against storms that threaten to tear them into the void. Sleep is shallow, broken by the roar of ice and the bite of frost. Hunger gnaws, water freezes in bottles, and the body turns inward, burning what it can to maintain life. Rescue is rarely immediate. Helicopters cannot always reach the high altitudes. Teams rely on radios that crackle with static in the storm. Every decision carries the weight of mortality. One misstep, one delay, and the mountain claims its due. Climbers move in small, deliberate groups, each member watching the other, counting breaths, checking frostbite, ensuring that the thin ropes of survival remain unbroken. The summit, while alluring, is often a cruel goal. Many turn back before reaching the peak, knowing that survival is more valuable than glory. Others push onward, drawn by the human desire to touch the impossible, to plant a flag where few have stepped. The cold reshapes everything. Skin peels, hair freezes, lips crack, voices are whispers, muffled behind scarves and masks, eyes water from both wind and exhaustion. Equipment coated in ice becomes almost unmanageable. Every action demands effort that would be trivial at sea level. Every moment is a confrontation with mortality. The mountains test not only physical strength, but mental endurance. Fear and awe mingle in every step, every foothold, every breath drawn against the wind. And yet, there is beauty in the relentless white. Snowfields stretch endlessly, untouched, pristine. Sunsets ignite the peaks in pinks and golds that no artist could replicate. Silence dominates between storms, a cold and absolute quiet that humbles even the most seasoned climbers. Those who survive a winter in the high peaks carry more than memories. They carry respect, understanding, and the knowledge that nature, in its coldest and harshest form, cannot be conquered, only endured, only honored. The final summit is not at the top of the mountain, but in the survival of the body and the spirit, through a winter that spares no one. From the dawn of human history, fire has been both a weapon and a comfort. In caves, our ancestors huddled around flickering flames, fragile against the infinite cold of the Ice Age. Every spark mattered. Every ember was a promise that the night could be survived. Fire warmed bodies, preserved food, and chased away predators that prowled beyond the reach of light. Without it, even the strongest hunters, the most clever gatherers, would have succumbed to frost. Through millennia, fire has been the fragile heartbeat of survival, the small, stubborn resistance against winters that stretch farther and harsher than the human imagination can endure. Civilizations learned to tend it, to nurture it, to carry it across frozen lands. The people of Çatalhöyük kept hearths alive through snow that swallowed rooftops. Vikings in Greenland and Iceland huddled around embers, listening to the wind rage against flimsy walls, understanding that warmth could not be demanded from the world, only preserved through patience and care. Empires, too, faced winters that no army could command. Rome's legions found their leather sandals useless against the frozen northern frontiers. Even the Grande Armée, the pride of Napoleon, could not outrun frostbite. Soldiers froze where their cannons could not fail. Warmth became the difference between life and death, between retreat and extinction. In later centuries, human ingenuity tried to tame cold with technology. Coal fires in factories, stoves in homes, blankets stitched with precision. And yet, no machine could fully shield people from the cruel hand of nature. During the Great Frost of 1709, the wine in barrels turned solid, and wolves prowled Parisian streets, a reminder that human progress could not conquer every winter. In the blizzards of Buffalo, New York, in 1777 at Valley Forge, and across the siege lines of Leningrad, fire remained the fragile line between life and surrender. People burned furniture, rationed warmth, and huddled together, clinging to heat and to hope. Even in modern imagination, fire is our symbol against cold. When scientists envisioned nuclear winter, they imagined skies blackened, harvests failing, and humanity shivering without warmth. Climbers on Everest, K2, and Denali still carry stoves, small flames that preserve fingers and morale in temperatures that strip skin from bone. Across all ages, the story is the same. Survival does not rely solely on strength, on numbers, or on tools. It relies on persistence, on tending the fragile flame of life in a world that can extinguish it with a single gust of frost. Winter teaches humility. It reminds us that humanity is not invincible. Survival is not guaranteed by ingenuity alone. It is earned in small acts, tending a fire, layering clothes, sharing warmth with a neighbor, keeping hope alive when everything outside the door is frozen solid. Fire is fragile, yes, but it is also enduring, passed from one generation to the next, a signal that humans persist, that life finds a way through the harshest winters. As the final chapter of our story unfolds, we see that humanity's triumph over cold is not measured by conquest but by endurance. The flicker of flame against darkness, the shivering bodies wrapped together, the careful watch over embers, all of these are victories. Winter may test us, but fire reminds us of what we can endure. The story of humanity and winter is, ultimately, a story of fragile fire, a story of persistence, and a story of warmth. It is a story that teaches us that to survive, to truly live, we must protect the fragile flame within and around us, no matter how long or how cold the night may be.